Thank you, Brian, and we are back. Our newsmaker guest this morning is Lee Bruner. We're talking about the Second Amendment, and Lee, already the phones are jumping off the hook, so let's go to the phones right away. Let's go to, is it Chuck there in Wise River?
That's right.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
You're on the air.
I know you're talking about Second Amendment, and I have a gun here in the house, so there's no problem. But what I wanted to suggest to David Berg is I have a foot of snow in my backyard, and I have 3 feet of snow in my driveway where I've had it plowed to get out to the Jerry Creek Road. And I was wondering if maybe David Berg could get 2 people in to talk about Al Gore's, quote, global warming.
I know it.
We've got all kind of weather problems on the East Coast and the Midwest and here in Montana, particularly where I live.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that people have been sold a bill of goods on this global warming thing, and I would like to have David invite 2 knowledgeable people, one pro and one con, to talk about this global warming.
Well, I'll tell you, we've talked about it many, many times, Chuck, and there's still a lot more to be said. And I know on a day like this, it's kind of hard to believe that we do have global warming, but I do thank you very much for your call this morning. Thanks a lot. Do call us again. Tim is calling from Kalispell. Tim, good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning. I have 2 questions for your guest. I believe that this is the most important, it's my opinion anyway, that this is the most important case the Supreme Court will decide on in American history. I think that that's just how important I think it is. My questions are, should, God forbid, the Supreme Court overturn the lower court's ruling and rule in favor of the cities, could individual state legislatures and governors pass state amendments declaring, like, hypothetically, that everyone who is a resident of the state of Montana belongs to the Montana militia, thus circumventing the court's decision should they overrule? That's my first question.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, that's an excellent question too, because I'm wondering about states' rights on this issue. It seems to me.
Well, that's just it. We're guaranteed underneath the Montana state Constitution the right to bear arms.
We sure are.
But if the anti-gun lobby always go with, as you were discussing earlier, the well-regulated militia. So if the Supreme Court overturns that ruling, could the governor of Montana and the state legislature of the state of Montana say, everyone who is a resident in the state of Montana is automatically, by their residency, part of a well-organized Montana state militia and therefore allowed to own and possess firearms in their own home?
Absolutely. Just swear us in.
My other question is, with the upcoming election, you know, it just kills me that some conservatives are so against McCain, but the next president will more than likely get to appoint another 1 or 2 Supreme Court justices. So if the court rules in favor of gun rights at a later date, when the court is stacked more liberal, can the court revisit the issue and overrule the court that sits now?
Well, they've done that before. Let's ask Lee Bruner. Thanks a lot for your call. Good, smart call too, Tim.
Tim, thank you very much. Your first question was, or your first point, I guess, was that this is probably the most important constitutional case that will ever be decided, and it's certainly up there. It's up there with the Dred Scott decision, the slaughterhouse cases that applied the amendments to state government. Your question about whether or not we could all become members of a militia, I'm actually involved in a case right now out of the 8th Circuit where the individual in question is a member of an organized militia, and the question is whether or not he can own a fully automatic weapon. And that's certainly not the way we want to win this issue. We want to win this issue on the fact that individual citizens have a right to keep and bear arms. But if God forbid we lose it, that is certainly an approach that could be taken. The federal constitution, unfortunately, is going to trump state constitutions, and I'm not sure if that was your question or not, but if the federal government says you can only have a firearm if you're a member of an organized militia, and of course Montana, it's in Section 12, has its right to bear arms in the Constitution, and it's clear that it's an individual right. The federal interpretation is going to trump, and their requirement that you be in an organized militia will control. Hopefully we never have to go there. Hopefully we'll win this decision up in the Supreme Court. And I'm sorry I've lost your second question, Tim.
Tim's not there now.
Oh,
well,
sorry.
Let me ask you a question, Lee. But let's go back to the mid or early 90s. There was a lot of discussion about guns and who had guns and whether they were available or not. We had assassinations of Robert Kennedy. We had, of course, the President Kennedy was killed as well. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. The James Brady shooting. All of these things led the Congress to give another look to banning certain types of weapons. That in itself was an infringement on the Second Amendment, I would think. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, by the plain language of the Second Amendment, it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The question then, if that is an individual right, the next question that will have to be decided is what arms does that apply to? Mm-hmm. It's not going to apply to chemical weapons or biological weapons. Individuals are not going to be given the permission to have biological weapons in their garage. Much like the First Amendment, we don't have any constitutional rights that are unlimited. Your right to free speech has limits on it. Mm-hmm. Your right to practice religion has limits on it. You cannot practice Aztec human sacrifice religion. And the right to keep and bear... Yeah, there you go. The right to keep and bear arms is going to be limited too, and there will be a whole slew of cases that we'll get to decide over the next a long period of time as to what are the limits of that right, how far does it go, what does it apply to. One of the things I'm really excited about in the Attorney General's office is this is an issue that's very important to Montana, and I happen to love constitutional law, and we're going to have the opportunity to start to, once we determine it's an individual right, to start to explore the scope of that right. Mm-hmm. And before we ever go there, the next question that's going to be decided in this case is whether or not the right to keep and bear arms in the federal Constitution applies to the states. Because Washington, D.C. is unique because it is not a state government. It is under the federal government. Mm-hmm. So the federal Constitution clearly applies to Washington, D.C., and they haven't even argued that it doesn't. But just because there is a right in the federal Constitution, does that protect you from state action? There was a very famous case out of Baltimore where the city of Baltimore dredged the harbor and they deposited a bunch of silt next to a guy's dock. And he sued, saying that the city of Baltimore had deprived him of his right to property because they had basically destroyed his property. And the federal government said, no, your right, keeping the government from depriving you of your property only applies to the federal government. It doesn't apply to a state government. And then, of course, we went through a series of cases over the years, eventually into the slaughterhouse cases, and finally they ended up at the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment, you have the Due Process Clause and the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and the court used the Privileges and Immunities Clause to say that no citizen of the United States shall be deprived of the privileges and immunities of citizenship. And they used that then selectively to apply the rights in the Constitution to individuals in the states. But they've done that. They could have done it just blanket and said all the rights that you have in the Constitution apply to against state governments. But they haven't chosen to do that. They've done it individually. So the next case that we'll see is whether or not this applies to state governments, probably coming out of Chicago or one of the states with a strong anti-gun legislation. We'll see some citizen coming forward and saying, you know what, I have a federal constitutional right to keep and bear arms. It should apply to the state of Illinois or the city of Chicago under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and that case will be decided. I suspect that case will be decided in favor of the individual, but it's one of the steps that we as constitutional attorneys will have to go through.
Oh boy, a lot of hoops. Let's get back to the phones. Homer is calling from Whitefish. Homer, you're on the air. Thanks for your call.